So we're in week 7 now, only one more week left to this class. And I'm so proud of all of you for having persevered this far. So for the week 7 forum, we're going to do personal bias. So we're going to become aware of what personal biases do we personally have. Every human being has biases. In other words, in this case, bias is seen as a kind of preference or choice that we make. That's the mildest definition of bias. So personal bias refers to learned beliefs, opinions, or attitudes that people are unaware of and often reinforce stereotypes. And so a lot of the biases that we have, we're unaware of them. And so these personal biases are unintentional, automatic, inbuilt, leading to false conclusions and valid and fallacious arguments. So for instance, some people think that all fat people are happy, for instance. And we get that fallacious argument from looking at Santa Claus. You know, how many times have you seen Santa Claus laughing and then his belly jiggles? Okay, I can still remember that image from childhood. And so a lot of the biases that we have, the unlearned, the unconscious biases that we get from the media, we get from television, we get from what we see and hear, we get from what we read. This is why it's important that we don't believe everything that we see, everything that we read, and that we use critical thinking skills to determine fact from fiction. We decide for ourselves if something is true or false. And when we want to look at bias in writing, I talked about this. We use kapow, we use ethos, logos, pathos. We have many, and we use the rhetorical triangle. We use many different methods in which to see if there is media bias. But also we have to be aware of our personal biases, not just the media bias, not just the bias that's in articles and in what's written. So in this forum, we're going to talk about each and every one of us having unconscious biases. And so some of the biases that lead to fallacious arguments, like ageism. Ageism, like once you reach the age of 65, why do people have to retire at the age of 65? What makes 65 such a magic age that suddenly you go from earning a lot of money, you're a productive member of society, and then suddenly your company retires you and you're being put to pasture? So that's called ageism, is the assumption that a person becomes unproductive or that a person is no longer have purpose in society because they are old. And so when we don't hire someone because of their age, that's ageism, and it's illegal. It's illegal to discriminate against someone because of their age. So ageism is very, very prevalent. For instance, when I went for an interview once for an ESL school, and then she took one look at my gray hair and said, oh, you know, once a year we have students that come to our school, they're over 50, and you could teach those students. Now that is a blatant ageism, because I wanted to be hired for all the students, not just the students who are over 50. So why are people over 40 or 50 suddenly they're a separate niche? So I remember being offended, and I said, and then I thought to myself, even if they hired me, I'm not going to work for them if they have such ageism beliefs. Okay, so ageism, in which you downplay or disrespect older people, or you don't hire people because of their age. And everybody thinks this way. Everyone, so what has that got to do with personal bias? Well, all of us would prefer to be young. How many of us put on makeup to hide our wrinkles? How many of us, as soon as we see an older person in the office, we naturally assume, oh, that person is going to make mistakes. Well, that person is going senile. Or that person can't remember things. Or that person is not capable of doing a hard assignment because he's too old. That's also ageism, and that's how it runs into our personal beliefs, our unconscious biases. So ageism is an example, because in American society, it's all about being young. And if you're not young, then you're considered old, you have no purpose, and we don't want to hire you because nobody wants to, and also we don't want to pay for your benefits because nobody wants to pay for all your sicknesses and your medicines. So everyone automatically assumes that if you're old, you're also sickly and therefore not fit for the job. That's also ageism. And so everyone, whether you believe it or not, even if you think of yourself as an enlightened person, we all think in those terms. We all want to be younger rather than older. As soon as you think, oh, I got to put makeup on my face to look younger, you're engaging in a form of ageism. Beauty bias. Okay, that's very similar. Beauty bias means that we think that, oh, the thinner we are, the more beautiful we are. The thinner we are, the happier we are. So everybody is trying to lose weight, and that if you're fat, that's really ugly. And if you want to promote your company, and this is illegal, you put all the thin, young people in the front of the office, and you put all the fat, old people at the back of the office. That's also illegal. And so beauty bias means that there's a certain preference towards a certain kind of beauty. What constitutes someone that's beautiful? When in reality, everybody is beautiful because we are all God's children, okay? And all of God's children is beautiful because we were all made in God's image. And as soon as we prefer one group of people over another group of people, we're disrespecting God, because then we're disrespecting a group of God's children, and we're disrespecting God's image. So that's my take on it. So God has no bias. God loves everyone. So beauty bias, however, humans have bias. And in all different, this is interesting, in all different cultures, there is beauty bias. In China, for instance, if you have really small feet, that's considered beautiful. Especially before, I say, the 20th century, in China, they used to make the rich women, if you're a kid, you know how when you're a child and your feet grow? Well, they make you wear these small shoes. And you have to wear these small shoes even if your feet outgrow the shoe. And your feet have to grow inside that shoe during your growing years, so that by the time you grow up, your feet are all like a stump. And that's considered beautiful in old-time China before the 20th century. So that's a kind of beauty bias. I don't think that exists anymore, but I had an old aunt who had those kind of stumped feet. So in every country, we all have beauty bias. In other words, what preferences of what we consider beautiful, when actually everybody is beautiful. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is that when we look at social media, we only want to hang out with people just like us, people who believe our beliefs. So if you're a Democrat, you want to hang out with everybody that's a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you want to hang out with everybody that's Republican. And within the last 4 or 5 years, I've heard about people who would defriend other people just because they're of a different opinion or something like that. So that's confirmation bias, means that you only want to be with others who believe like you believe. I've also heard of people who actually move out of a blue state into a red state so that they could be with people that believe just that. So that's called confirmation. It's also known as an echo chamber. Social media, especially Facebook, is guilty of having these algorithms where the Facebook would determine what sites and what kind of people you most likely want to hang out with, and then based on how long you look at a certain site. So if Facebook determines that you're looking at a particular website a long time, and you click like to all of the, say, Democrat kind of websites, then the newsfeed will then send you, the Facebook newsfeed will only send you stuff that you like, such as Democrat stuff, or such as Republican stuff, or such as other people who are also Democrats. So that's how these echo chambers originally started off as Facebook algorithms, so that everybody would just, and that's what's causing a lot of the polarization, but that's too political. So confirmation bias simply is hanging with people that you believe in, that you not believe in, that has the same beliefs as you do. It's actually much healthier to try to widen your horizons and hang out with people who are different from you, so that you learn diversity, you learn different cultures, you learn to expand. And we talked about this in the week 7 in English 101, the importance of diversity. So that's the opposite of confirmation bias. Then you have ableism. Ableism is when you have a bias against disabled people. So that if you see someone in a wheelchair, and let's say you're an employer, you see someone and the person that you're going to interview is in a wheelchair, you automatically think, oh, she's just not as able to do the job because she's in a wheelchair. That's called ableism bias, is when you just assume without asking that person, without getting to know that person. That's similar to judging someone by their skin color and not by their character, just like what Martin Luther King said. He wanted a world where he's judged by his heart, by his character, by his integrity, rather than by his skin color. And so when we automatically judge a disabled person just because she's sitting in a wheelchair as being less able to do a job than someone who's not in a wheelchair, that's known as ableism bias. And everyone has that kind of bias. Gender bias. All right, so gender bias occurs when you prefer one gender over the other unfairly. And so in the workplace, females are not promoted as often as males are promoted. So that if the boss has a preference, who he's going to hire, who he's going to promote to the higher level, he would promote the man. Because the bias is that, well, the females are going to get pregnant, leave the workforce for a while before they come back, making this much more inconvenient for the company, and that it's much more convenient to have the male. And so when you have gender bias is when you prefer one gender over the other. And it is a fact that females are not paid equally to the same job as what a man. So if you have a man and a woman doing the same job, having the same number of experience for that job, the man gets paid more than the woman. And so that's known as a gender bias. And also in politics, Hillary Clinton was, like if you're a woman, they would not only would they comment, the critics comment on your ability, they would also comment on the way you dress. They comment on your emotional state. I think they said about Hillary Clinton that she doesn't cry enough. She doesn't show enough emotion, or that she wears out of fashion clothes. What's that got to do with your ability to be a president? And so that's also gender bias, because we don't say the same thing usually about a guy. We don't say, oh, he's wearing too many red ties, therefore, or blue ties, therefore Mr. Smith is not fit to be president, or that sort of thing. So that is also gender bias. And then you've got name bias. Name bias is if you prefer, so let's say someone has an African sounding name, you would think, no, I'm not going to hire Letitia or Denisha because that's too African sounding. That's called name bias, and that's also illegal. By the way, gender bias is illegal, ableism is illegal, but people get away with it. Ageism is illegal, but then people get away with it anyway, okay? So let's say you get fired because of your age, then that person's part of your severance package is that you agree not to tell everybody in the world that you were fired because of your age. So that shuts people up so that they can get their severance pay. So that's how ageism is able to flourish in American business culture. But it's also illegal. A lot of these biases are like prejudice, and therefore that's against the law, because you're not supposed to discriminate against someone's gender, against someone's sexual preference, against someone's religion, against someone's gender, against someone's disability, and the way someone looks, and how old someone is, etc., etc., etc. Yet, people have these biases anyway. And if you look at the fashion industry, that's where we get back to beauty bias. Why are all the models so thin? Why do we have to think that, why can't the models be big? And so only recently, in recent years, have they finally have models that are plus size, that represent the true size of the American woman. So that's only recently. So the fashion industry is very guilty of beauty bias, even to this day, where you have models who are so thin, like toothpicks. And so that's beauty bias. So far I've gone over ageism, which is bias against old people, beauty bias, which is bias if you think thin is better than fat. Confirmation bias is when on social media you only hang out with people you like and you defriend those who disagree with you. Ableism is when you look down on disabled people. Gender bias is if you think that men are better than women. And name bias is, which all of these biases are illegal to, it's illegal to say, oh, I'm not going to hire someone named Denisha, or, oh, her name is Janet Huang, and she's got a Chinese sounding name. We're not going to hire that person either. So that's also illegal. So that's called name bias, when you not hire people with foreign sounding names. And then you've got similarity bias. That means you only hire people that are similar to you. You only hire people that come from the same school as you. But as you know, a lot of law firms hire only people who graduate from Harvard or Yale. And so similarity bias, although it's illegal, isn't that the ironic illegal for a law firm? Okay, that's so ironic. Anyway, so that similarity bias is only, and also not only that you hire people that are similar to you, but you only choose to work with people that are similar to you, like the same race, the same school, the same philosophy. That's also illegal, because that means that such a company lacks diversity. And so you have to respect everybody and include everybody. That's what's legal. So you have similarity bias. Then you have status quo bias. So status quo bias means that you refuse to diversify your company, showing a resistance to change. It's very similar, so that status quo means something that stays the same. And so status quo bias is very similar to similarity bias, where you only hire people that are just like you. So somebody with a foreign sounding name, or somebody who is of a different school, opinion, or race is not hired, and only someone that looks like you, or talks like you, or thinks like you, or went to the same school as you, a whole company of people that are all alike. That's all called similarity bias and status quo bias. And that means that if you tell that company, now you need to diversify, but that company resists change, that's known as status quo bias. And then you have overconfidence bias, in that we think that we are better than we really are at our jobs. So this kind of person would be like if you were to critique this person at work, and then this person becomes really offended and says, wait a minute, I'm good at everything I do because I'm perfect. In other words, someone with a perfectionism bias, a bias towards thinking that he is perfect. Well, in reality, only God is perfect. Humans are all flawed. Otherwise, Eve would not have taken the fruit, and Adam and Eve would not have eaten the fruit of temptation. If humans were perfect, we would still be in the Garden of Eden, and we would not need Jesus to redeem us. Okay? So just from that fact alone, humans are flawed. Nobody is perfect. Therefore, overconfidence bias means that you think you're perfect at everything that you do. That you think that your opinion is always right. That you are superior to other people. And that your opinion is superior to other people. So that's known as overconfidence bias. and that you're really not that good at what you think you're good at. So that means you're overconfident. And of course, people like that tend to be very toxic, and it's difficult to get along with someone who thinks that they are always right. So I'm tempted to, if I had students in this lecture, I would then at this point stop my lecture and ask them, have you ever known somebody with an overconfidence bias? And when I used to teach face-to-face, oh my God, the whole class erupts in laughter because everybody has known somebody with an overconfidence bias. And a lot of celebrities develop this bias because they grow ahead. Their head becomes so big, and they become divas, That means that you think you're hot. Nothing could ever knock you off your pedestal, okay? You put yourself on a pedestal. Perception bias. A perception bias is when you perceive the world in overly simplistic assumptions. In other words, you think that all Chinese people are geeks, or all Chinese people are math majors, okay? Then that is called a perception bias. Of course, an easier term for this that everybody knows more about is racism, okay? So perception bias is also illegal. Although, interestingly, overconfidence bias is not illegal. It's just simply annoying to be with someone like that. Anyway, so a perception bias. And so here's a true story. And I told this to my English 101 class in week 7. So if you've already been in my English 101 class, you already know this story. So there I am walking on campus, and I'm on my way to class, and I'm late. And then this complete stranger stops me. And then she says, oh my God, you're Chinese. Oh, can you help me with my math? Because all Chinese people are good at math, and I'm flunking my math class, and I'll pay you good money to be my tutor. And then I wasn't offended or anything. I was just simply surprised. And then I had to patiently tell her that I'm an English major and that I'm really bad at math. In fact, I had to take my SAT math section 7 times, 5, 6 or 7 times, either 5, 6 or 7 times. In other words, many, many, many times. I had to take the math section of the SAT just to get a passing score. And I also know that if you sign your name legibly for the SAT math, you get 250 points. How do I know this? Well, when the very first time I took SAT math, I got 250 points. This meant I got every single math question wrong, and the only thing I did right was I signed my name correctly. So that proves to you that I really stink at math. On the other hand, when I took my SAT English, I got a 100%, 800 out of 800, the very first try, because I always thought English was easy and fun, which is why today I teach English, I don't teach math. And I remember when I told this to this person, this stranger, she looked so flabbergasted. She couldn't believe it. She goes, but all my Chinese friends are good at math. And I said, well, you met the one exception to the rule. I stink at math, I'm Chinese, and it proves to you that you can't believe, of course I didn't say this to her, this proves that you can't believe in stereotypes. And so it's true that a lot of Chinese people are good at math because in China they teach algebra in the 4th grade, whereas in America they don't teach algebra until the 9th grade. So there is some truth to that particular stereotype. A lot of stereotypes come with a little bit of truth attached to it. But you cannot overgeneralize that a whole group shares one trait. So that's known as a perception bias when you overgeneralize and you end up with hasty generalization fallacy. So that all of these biases result in fallacies. A fallacy is when you make a claim based on false evidence. So all of the television ads are all fallacies of relevance because they make a claim and they don't back it up with documentation. So if I say 9 out of 10 people should, 9 out of 10 dentists recommend Dentyne as a good, for fighting cavities, as a gum, that's a fallacy because you're making a false claim who are these 9 out of 10 dentists? You lack documentation, so that results in a fallacy. So when we write our papers, we want to avoid biases by having a counter-argument and rebuttal paragraph, and we want to avoid fallacies by using credible evidence, and we find credible evidence by using peer-reviewed articles in our library and by using CAPAL to ascertain that a source is credible. So for the Week 7 forum, you're going to write about what personal biases do you have? What are your biases? What unconscious biases do you have? And I was reading on the net, you can take a test called the implicit bias test. And that test will tell you what biases you have. And so I will look for that link. Okay, so if you take the implicit, if you don't know, if you're like, really, that's a hard forum. I don't know what biases I have. You could take the implicit bias test to figure out what biases you have. But most people, the biases I just went over in this talk, everybody has these kind of biases because it's ingrained inside American society. That's why. That's why I went over ageism bias, beauty bias, confirmation bias, ableism bias, gender bias. Even if you think, oh, but I'm an enlightened person, I'm educated, I don't think that fat people or thin people are any different, and I don't look down on old people. I love my grandmother, or I believe in equal opportunity for men and women, so I don't have any biases. Well, we all have unconscious biases just by being part of American society. So the biases that we all have are ingrained into us just by being American, because in American society, we value youth. In American society, we value thin people. We value able-bodied people, as opposed to so on and so on and so on. So if I were to rephrase the question, what biases do Americans have? Not you personally, but what personal biases do Americans have? If that makes it easier for you to write for this forum, then you can post your answer that way as well. Because if you come up blank saying, but I'm an enlightened person, okay, that's an overconfidence bias. When you think you're really better than you really are at a particular skill. Everybody has biases. So we're going to talk about our personal biases and what personal biases Americans have. And we're going to discuss in the Week 7 forum about ageism, beauty, confirmation, gender bias, name bias, similarity bias, status quo bias, overconfidence bias, and perception bias. And so which one of these biases are you guilty of, or have you seen other people guilty of? And usually my students have no problem writing about they've seen or known a boss who's had the overconfidence bias, the boss who thinks she knows everything. So that's an example of personal biases. So I hope that this talk gave you some good ideas on how to fill out the Week 7 forum on personal biases. So if you have any questions, okay, you can feel free to email me.